Welcome to the Steelers Breakdown Podcast with Penn Live Steelers beat reporter Nick Farabaugh. We are coming on the air just as we have breaking news yet again on the Brandon Aiyuk situation that seems the most positive yet that I've heard. And we're going to get to that right off the top of the show. But we've had our first preseason game, and we're hot on the heels of the next one, where we're getting some national pundits and ex-pro players weighing in on Justin Fields unfavorably, and we've yet to see Russell Wilson take action in a Steelers uniform, but I think we're close to that, so we're going to go over that. And then there's a lot of fallout on the offensive line after the first-round draft pick, Troy Fautanu, got injured, even as he looked like he had locked down that right tackle position and solidified it early in his gestation as a Steeler. And then on the other side of the football, we have a surging cornerback who, after a year delay due to injury, is wasting no time rocketing up the depth chart and looking like the real deal. So Nick has been watching it all unfold up close and personal. So we'll get his take on all of that and more. But first, I feel like the Pittsburgh psyche has been all over the map as far as these tidbits about Brandon Aiyuk possibly liking the Steelers and wanting to play for the Steelers exclusively, liking the Steelers offer and favoring that over whatever San Francisco is dishing out. So are we close? Where are we? And is this the final act?
John, I've thought we might be close for a week now, and it's day 10. We're in the 5th, 6th month of this saga, and honestly, I think we're starting to round this up. It feels like we are getting to a spot where something has to happen from the 49ers' perspective. Either Brandon Aiyuk has to accept that offer, or they are going to trade it, or they have to up their offer. I think that's where it stands right now. I think the ball is in San Francisco's court. That's what I think we're at this point. The Pittsburgh Steelers have met their demands to a degree. It seems like there's a framework there. They have a framework with Brandon Aiyuk for a deal. So really, the Steelers gave the 49ers a framework of a contract that Brandon Aiyuk would accept, because Brandon Aiyuk, if traded to the Steelers, is going to accept their offer within minutes of the deal. So it will be done. So really, the 49ers, and the fact that they haven't signed Brandon Aiyuk, it makes sense that they looked at the contract the Steelers were going to offer him and didn't really love it. And so they're either going to have to pay up to Brandon Aiyuk, or they're at some point going to have to trade him. Maybe there's a short-term offer they can do to kind of meet in the middle of this, but it really seems like, John, and kind of how I've heard and read this, is that the 49ers, one, want to keep Brandon Aiyuk because he's their best wide receiver. And they want to win a Super Bowl this year. So it makes complete sense to want to keep Brandon Aiyuk. Brandon Aiyuk will not play on the 5th-year option. I think he's getting $14 or so million right now. He wants to play on a new contract with long-term security. So it doesn't seem like he wants to play on this 5th-year option. And 3, I don't think they love the offer the Steelers have given them, but the Steelers are the only option because Aiyuk has told Cleveland and New England no. And so you have leverage being played here, and you have a decision that really is in San Francisco's court. Either they have to pay Aiyuk, they have to find some random short-term solution, and John, maybe that's where this comes in, is maybe they go up to Brandon Aiyuk at some point and say, you know what, we can't come to an agreement on a long-term deal. We don't really like the compensation Pittsburgh will give us. So what if we up your salary by so much money? We won't tag you. One more run at the Super Bowl, and next March you can hit the open market and see where you want to go. I think that could be a viable solution to this situation if things come down to it. That feels like the last thing John Lynch and the 49ers can do at this point. But it really seems like, John, the more time that passes, the likelier it is that I think Brandon Aiyuk becomes a Pittsburgh Steeler. It feels like that. If the offer was there on the table for him from San Francisco, he would have re-signed.
Right. So this is more than just a crack the door is left to crack open. You're thinking the time is on our side for Brandon Aiyuk to be a Steeler. But tell me, what is the framework that Steelers going to give San Fran in return for the talented wide receiver? So where are we? Where is the Steelers' offer in terms of what we're giving up?
Right. I don't think it's going to be anything near what New England and Cleveland was offering. Cleveland was offering Amari Cooper a second and a fifth. The Steelers, I don't even know if they're going to give up a player in this deal. I know they've thrown James Daniels out there, but the 49ers have asked for, guys like Minka Fitzpatrick and George Pickens and Alex Highsmith. And Steelers are just not going to give that up.
I heard Freiermuth was also listed
Right.
as one.
He also was a guy discussed, but the Steelers are just not going to give up that type of player in this deal. They don't want to give up that type of player. The point of trading for Brandon Aiyuk is to pair him with George Pickens, is to make this team stronger than it was, is to fill the last big void, if you will, on the team. And so that's what I think is the option here. And so what I would say the framework is, and I would guess is probably a second round pick, a third round pick, and maybe some type of swap in the late rounds. I think that's where we're going to see it. But I think multiple day 2 picks is where this is going to come in at if Brandon Aiyuk is traded to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Because, John, I've been told repeatedly that the 49ers have been calling around the NFL to other teams to try and trade for a wide receiver. Because the Steelers don't have a wide receiver that they would want outside of George Pickens. And so they are calling around trying to find anyone that is willing to move a wide receiver. And so that is kind of the plan for the 49ers if they do move Brandon Aiyuk. I also think that's part of why this has been complicated, right? Why it hasn't happened yet. Because the 49ers are calling around and asking teams who's available, who could they pursue at wide receiver if they trade Brandon Aiyuk. And so I think there's multiple moving spots to this. But the Steelers and 49ers, essentially, this framework between the contract and the trade compensation has been there for days. The Steelers have just been waiting to hear back, and the 49ers have been discussing contract with Brandon Aiyuk. So it's really coming down to where the 49ers go there. And it really doesn't seem very promising, to be quite honest with you, John, that they haven't agreed to something yet. Again, they have a framework for a deal. Aiyuk has a framework for a deal from the Pittsburgh Steelers. If Brandon Aiyuk doesn't get something similar to that deal, the parameters of that deal don't match what the Steelers are offering, he has no incentive to take it because he naturally is going to get paid quite handsomely if he gets traded to Pittsburgh.
Speaking of wide receivers, Pittsburgh frenemy was recently in the news. Juju Smith-Schuster was cut by New England, and they're eating quite a bit of dead money on him. Any chance he resurfaces somewhere?
I wouldn't rule it out that the Steelers would look into that, first of all. I wouldn't rule it out. I think he's a little redundant with what they kind of have because Calvin Austin III and Roman Wilson are both slot receivers. And remember, Juju was almost always a slot guy here in Pittsburgh. He's a bigger slot guy. He's a big kind of power slot that blocks and gets in there. So he fits the offense in that regard. Arthur Smith would love Juju in terms of his blocking acumen and his football IQ. So he would fit that part of the offense. I also I just think the athleticism he once had, John, his knees have caught up to him. He's had numerous knee injuries over his career. You watch him in New England last year. It was hard to watch. He couldn't really separate consistently. He is not the same Juju Smith-Schuster that left Pittsburgh in 2021. And so I wouldn't put your hopes up for a guy that's going to come in here and be a massive solution. I also don't necessarily think it's an either-or solution when we're talking about Brandon Aiyuk. It wouldn't stun me completely if they traded for Brandon Aiyuk and added Juju on a vet minimum contract. I think anything that you can do to boost this wide receiver room is something you could do. And he would certainly add depth to the blocking part of that game. But I think it's going to be a little bit until he finds a spot. I think his knees are going to have to get checked out. He's going to have to pass physicals. He is just not the same person and player he was. And so if I were the Steelers personally, John, I wouldn't be making the move. I think there are better options out there, even if you are looking for guys to maybe trade for on cut down day. I would much rather have Robert Woods, for example, from the Houston Texans, who might be their wide receiver 4 or 5 this year. So I would call them up before I would add Juju Smith-Schuster, but I can't fully rule it out. He's a familiar face. They know what he would bring to the table, and he does fit the qualities that Arthur Smith likes in wide receivers.
I'll tell you, listening to you talk about Juju and the physical decline, it's just a reminder to everybody, life comes at you fast in the NFL. And, I know he was a Pittsburgh nemesis, but Jerry Glanville nailed it. The NFL stands for not for long, man. It's just amazing the churn of some of these guys that just get eaten up, all too suddenly, like a Juju, where, like you said, he's even last year you were noticing that this diminishment of his skills and his physicality. Speaking of diminishment, some people were down on Justin Fields after his outing, even though it was, not an extended start that he had, in Pittsburgh versus the Texans. But some national guys and pro guys seemed to be all over him, thinking he might have fumbled away his opportunity to be in a real battle with Russell Wilson. How did you size up Fields' performance and what's been said after the fact, and how much of a look are we going to get at Russell Wilson against the Bills?
Well, first of all, I think you're going to see a good deal of Russell Wilson, at least 2 or 3 drives, I would think. They need to see him in a live pocket. That's what they need to see from Justin Fields too. Justin Fields looks great in training camp, but it also fits his strengths. He's got great rushing ability, of course. He's got this arm he's got a howitzer, honestly. He can absolutely throw it all over the field, to all areas of the field, hit tight windows, and we see it in practice. But, John, I think we saw some things come up in that Texans game that have been just issues with Justin Fields. First of all, he leads the NFL over the last 3 years in fumbles by quarterbacks. He's a volatile player in that regard. He takes a lot of sacks. We saw him take a sack that probably shouldn't have happened against the Texans. And so we saw the good and the bad. We saw him get into a rhythm and move them down the field, but then there were 2 fumbles, and then there was bad sacks, and all of that killed that drive's momentum. So it really probably was 70% good, 30% bad. But that 30% bad, those are drive killers, John. And as a quarterback, you can't have your quarterback killing drives, because he did put up a big fat goose egg over those 3 drives he had. And I think that's really kind of the takeaway from it, is he had opportunity. They were moving the football down the field. He was an efficient passer in this game. He was 5 for 6 with 67 yards. He should have been 6 for 6. Van Jefferson caught that out route that he threw too, which obviously that's not on him. That should have been a 3rd down conversion. But I think you look at what he did, and you can take away positives from it. You can take away, I thought he was decisive. I thought he didn't really hold the ball too much outside of the 1 sack where I thought he hitched and kind of panicked. But it didn't really come up too much. He was decisive. He was sound in his mechanics. He put the ball in harmless way in terms of throwing the ball, nowhere near an interception. He found his open men consistently throughout that game. And so I think there's positives and negatives to take away. I don't think he fumbled any opportunity away from competing with Russell Wilson. In practice, he continues to go, honestly, John, throw for throw with him, just out there. Russell Wilson has a big throw. Justin Fields responds with a big throw. But I want to see these guys in a live pocket, because that is where we see their biggest weaknesses. It's always not, in training camp where they are not going to be hit. You can have guys blitzing, but there's not really a lot of stakes to it. It's when you get, pressured and you maybe make an errant throw into a tight window that gets picked off. That's where I want to see both of them, not just Justin Fields, Russell Wilson too. Russell Wilson does the same stuff. He runs into bad sacks. And so I want to see that part of these guys' games show up. And so I thought, Justin Fields, to put it up in one word, was fine against the Texans. I didn't think he was great. I didn't think he was particularly abhorrently bad. I thought he was just fine. He needs to be a lot better than fine to win the bet.
Right. And drive killers are something this team is not built to handle. Like you said, you talk about the completions and the yardage you put up, but if you have drive killers like fumbles and sacks, and that's where you get the anemic points that per game, that where Pittsburgh was down in the dumps in the basement these last couple of years when it comes to points per game. You know what I mean? We're not putting enough points, and it's putting the onus on the defense. Points per game I think is a big issue that we have to show that we can put more points on the board, and drive killers are just not going to allow that to happen the way this offense is built, where we want to run the ball.
Right. And I will say this, John. I think there was a big difference from the Matt Canada offense to what we saw to Justin Fields and even Kyle Allen. The Steelers only scored 12 points in that game, but it looked prettier. And I mean that in that they had explosive plays consistently. I think they had like 12 or 13 plays of 15 or more yards. I could probably count on one hand how many times that happened in Matt Canada's tenure with the Pittsburgh Steelers. So that's encouraging. The process part of it, where they were actually moving the ball, is encouraging. But they have to finish drives. We saw what happened when they got in the red zone at times as well. And Justin Fields also needs to follow that, where they don't have these drive-killing sacks or fumbles or missing a guy wide open in the end zone like Kyle Allen and Calvin Austin could hook up on that obvious touchdown on the slot fade. So I thought there were encouraging signs from the offense, and that I think that they executed the game plan to a degree, but the basics need to be honed in. That's really what it was. It was the basics of offensive football that hurt them. They would have a bad play. They would have a holding call or a false start or a wide open guy and the quarterback missed them. It's just basics like that you need to clean up. But I thought there were good signs. I thought Arthur Smith particularly called quite a good game in his first action with the Steelers.
Speaking of that game and the offense, we had a little bit of a setback, and perhaps a bigger setback on the offensive line, where we had the first-round draft pick and a guy who was surging in camp and really cementing the right tackle position, Troy Fautanu, who is now injured for perhaps the rest of the preseason. So, and now we're seeing some fallout from that, this reshuffling along the line that certainly has to disrupt the forward momentum that we were hoping to see of the installation of the Arthur Smith offense. So talk about all those ramifications and how they sort of move down the line, Nick.
Yeah, well, it seems like Fautanu is still going to start week one. And I think that's the interesting part of this. He impressed so much in those first 2 weeks of training camp and what they saw out there against the Texans, that seems like he's going to start anyway. So I'm interested to see how quickly he can use those 2 weeks leading up from the end of that Detroit game to the first game against Atlanta on the 8th of September and kind of get up to speed, because I think he will miss that Detroit game in addition to this Buffalo game. But I think he'll have a week or two leading up to that game where he can practice with the first team. So I'm interested to see that. First of all, anytime a rookie misses significant time in the preseason process, I think it's cause for concern. But I think Troy Fautanu was so polished and ready to go. And I know his first game wasn't super polished or fit that resume, but he hurt his knee probably pretty early in the game. The Steelers didn't even know he hurt his knee until he came in at halftime and asked for a knee brace. I mean, that's the type of guy we're talking about here. He's iron tough, and so I think he still starts. I also think Zach Frazier will start at center, and so I think you're going to have two rookies here. And so I think the bigger question, John, isn't even necessarily what happens with Frazier and Fautanu. It's what happens with Broderick Jones. I don't know what they're doing right now with Broderick Jones, and I said this a little bit yesterday on Steelers Breakdown, because with Fautanu hurt, Jones is playing at right tackle. But if Fautanu starts at right tackle, Jones is going to be playing at left tackle. I don't see any scenario where Dan Moore starts week one and Broderick Jones is on the bench with Fautanu starting at right tackle. So you need to get Broderick Jones more left tackle reps. I think that's where the fallout is here. How do they get him? And you mentioned Tykeem Dawes, who is this really big mauler from the Ravens that they claim. Probably a guy that's more just kind of there to compete for a practice squad spot than anything, but he can at least give them flexibility to start moving Broderick Jones back to left tackle. And so Dan Moore can't play right tackle. He's not comfortable playing there. That's fine. It's fine and good. But they need to start getting Broderick Jones over to left tackle. So Dan Moore probably needs to start taking second-team left tackle reps at that point. So that's where the fallout's going to be here. It's going to be how much Broderick Jones plays at left tackle leading up to the season, because I think he needs it more. He always has been a raw kind of pass protector coming out of Georgia, and last year you saw him down the stretch, great run blocker, struggle a little bit in the pass pro side of things. So I want to see him get more reps there to make him more comfortable. And so I think that's where the transition is going to be kind of rocky, because I just don't think we've seen a ton of Broderick Jones at left tackle, Troy Fautanu at right tackle. We started to see that last week. But now you're talking, Fautanu doesn't come back until late August. You're not talking about those two having reps together until maybe a week and a half before they go to Atlanta. So I think that's the concern. What's the chemistry going to be like? How does this thing gel? I think that's really where the concerns come in more than, say, what does Fautanu look like on the right side? I think it's going to be, how do they get to Broderick Jones playing significant left tackle snaps over the next 2 weeks in these next two games with Fautanu out?
I'll tell you, I just want to point out to the audience, what you heard there was great analysis, how one injury to one player is affecting another player on the opposite side of the line. You could have a situation where Troy Fautanu comes back and plays well after this injury because he's more of a natural right tackle, but where you have your first round pick from last year, Broderick Jones, suffering more due to this injury to his teammate. This could be very ironic, but it could be a key concern for what you said, the chemistry and the gelling of this offensive line. That is something to watch. And that was great analysis. Speaking of analysis, I heard...
We have to watch.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's something we have to watch very closely with Broderick Jones, because I am concerned about Broderick Jones not having the significant amount of reps he needs on the left side.
Right. And we know the left tackle is an all-important position, the quarterback's blind side. But speaking of analysis by Nick, and some of the most glowing that I've heard is your take on Corey Trice Jr., the cornerback with all the size and the measurables, who basically was injured early in last year's training camp and is sort of like having an extra pick in this year's draft, because his impact is going to be carried forward to this year, not last year. So, and I hear he's making quite the impact.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see Corey Trice, because the first 2 weeks of training camp, they purposely limited him. Remember, he's coming back from a torn ACL in his right knee. He tore his left ACL in college, so he's torn both ACLs. And so they're taking, baby steps with him. So he only played 11 snaps against the Texans. He came in during that final kind of little period in the fourth quarter, made that great stop on the screen play, and that's really all you saw of him. But this week he's played more than he has since he ever suffered that injury. Dante Jackson's a little banged up. Nothing serious. They're just holding him out, letting him heal up. So they've given Corey Trice the first-team reps all week over the last 2 practices, John. He's done really well. I mean, he's going up against Van Jefferson, Pat Freiermuth, George Pickens, and he's going toe-to-toe with them. He's had a number of pass breakups. If you remember last year, John, going back to this time last year, this was around the time where Corey Trice suffered that injury. He didn't even play in the first preseason game, but you remember before that, where the buzz was all about how this 7th-round pick on the outside was playing so well and going toe-to-toe with Deontay Johnson and George Pickens and making plays on the football. He's starting to get back to that. He's starting to become more comfortable in his knee. And so I think you're seeing it more and more. Steelers really have a question on these backup corners, John. I think everybody knows Jackson and Porter are going to start. But who's going to be the top backup on the outside? Jackson's a guy that's been injured significantly, frequently over his last few years in Carolina. So that is a concern. And Corey Trice seems like he's going to be the main guy there. He's going to be the top backup. I think he's solidifying that. And I think he's really intriguing for them as a piece of the future. he only fell, John, because of the knee injury he suffered at Purdue. Teams were a little concerned by it, and that's why he fell to the 7th round. We're talking about a guy that was probably a 3rd-round talent that they got in the 7th, and so he's now out here kind of showing what he can do. Very smart football player, willing to do whatever it takes to make the roster. He's playing as that 6 DB in the dime packages too, so he's playing on the inside. It's kind of interesting to see how they've been using him. And so I think he's a guy that's going to take significant step up. He's going to get playing time. I think he's going to be a pretty big part of this secondary when you talk about it. So, yeah, keep an eye on Corey Trice. And I'm really excited to see him against the Bills, both in the joint practice on Thursday and in the game on Saturday.
Yeah, and to hear you talk about the kid gloves they're using with Corey, I mean, the quote you had from his position coach sounding more nervous than him about getting him out there and testing those knees. That was pretty telling.
Yeah, I think it was. And you could tell by the way Grady Brown, the secondary coach, answered it that they were a little worried about getting Corey Trice just to the first preseason game, getting him healthy. And Corey seemed to be pretty confident in his knee. So he's jumping, cutting, doesn't really have any tentativeness on it. So he's playing very fluid and fast, which is what you want after that injury.
And we all know that the Steelers will not negotiate contracts once the regular season begins. We're still in that window where something could happen with new contracts. Is there any news afoot on contracts regarding Cameron Hayward or Jaylen Warren? Is there anything, any smoke coming out of the South Side?
So here's the thing, John. I do think Pat Freiermuth gets done. I think his contract will
or the
be
North
done
Side
before Week 1 against the Falcons. I also think we've talked about Aiyuk and kind of where that has gone over the past few weeks. And it feels like the Aiyuk contract that could be looming has kind of stopped them from extending any, but just how do you allocate the cap space? How do you want this structured? So once if the Aiyuk trade happens and he signs his extension, I'd expect a Pat Freiermuth extension very shortly after that. And we'll see the structure of it. I think they're going to have different structures depending on if Aiyuk comes, if he doesn't, etc. As for Cam Hayward, I think that one's going to go down to the buzzer. And by that, I mean, I think, this thing could happen. You remember TJ Watt's deal happened, 2 days before the first game that year? I could see a similar thing with Cam Hayward. I don't think they have been rushing to get Cam Hayward done, but I think that's going to be the next move because I think Pat Freiermuth's deal is essentially done, and they're just going to kind of toy with that structure depending on how this Aiyuk thing goes. And so I really think Cam Hayward's deal is going to be up after that, and we'll see what happens there. It's a hard situation, John. We've talked about this. He's a 35-year-old coming off a significant injury. And granted, he doesn't get hurt very much. This is like the first significant injury he's had in like 6-7 years in his career. He's been very durable. Mm-hmm. And he's not going to fall off until the power in his game is gone because he is a guy that is a powerful player. He's a power rusher first, and that's when he'll fall off. But we've seen defensive linemen in the vein of Cam Hayward play till they're 38, 39. He could theoretically have 3 more years in him where he's still playing very well. And so I'm interested to see how that goes, but I think that one will come straight down to the buzzer. Outside of those two guys, I don't expect we'll see anyone else.
Okay, good. But you're right. With Aiyuk in the mix, everything is frozen. Any idea what the time window when we're going to know one way or the other on Aiyuk? I mean, how long will this drag out?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's coming to a head here soon. I think we'll know by the end of the week. That's kind of just a soft timeline where I'm thinking. But the 49ers could drag this out a long time, waiting for another team to jump in, trying to get this contract done, trying to kind of get him to cave. It could still go on, but it feels like with today's report, John, that it's starting to come to the finish line. That's just where it feels like. I haven't really heard a definite timeline, though, so who knows? This saga's been going on for a week, and it's felt like it's been happening for 2 years.
You're right about that, and I'll